So we will begin, as we do each week, as we do a review. And what this is for us to have a better ability to remember the book. If there was something you wanted to take somebody directly to, you'd go, let me see if I can remember. There's only 12 chapters. And if you've got an overview in your mind, even a word or two of what's in each chapter, it can help you go there if you wanted to share something with someone. So in chapter 1, a little bit of the overview that we did before we started, what did we say this type of literature is? It's considered wisdom literature. And who's the author? Solomon. And we will have confirmation of that in the last chapter as we go through that. And we found out that Solomon was a man that had been given more wisdom and discernment than any man before him or after him, which would explain why he was such an amazing author in so many ways, and we will look at that as well. We talked about Ecclesiastes being Solomon's theory on the meaning of life, that there was nothing new under the sun to give man meaning in life, and that the thesis of the meaning of life cannot actually be found in the creation, and therefore it is vanity to try to seek to find it there. And by under the sun, we had defined that meant on earth. Then we went to chapter 2. So does that give you an overview of chapter 1? Then we moved on to chapter 2. And in chapter 2, we have Solomon's personal experience in a couple of areas. And what were those areas? He tried to find it through wisdom and through his wealth. And he said it wasn't found in either of those. And what we say is what was not found. In Ecclesiastes, the terms that are used are the advantage in life, and we talked about that being the profit. What is the profit to living a life, or the advantage to living the life? Where do you go to find that? That was his question. Then we moved to what I thought was a great chapter, in chapter 3, where we found out there's an appointed time for every event under the sun, right? Everything is already planned by a sovereign God. Nothing falls outside of his sovereign will. Then we move to chapter 4, that God does allow wicked men with their hearts given to self-serving motives to oppress others. That's just the reality of life. So as you turn on the news or any other events that come to your life, you need to remember Solomon already gave you a heads up that that's going to be what happens and that you're going to see oppression. Don't be surprised by it. Don't question whether there is or isn't a God based on the fact that that's what you see. Chapter 5 moved on to what? How to approach God. And we do that in reverence, seeking only to know his will in every situation. And you're not there to change God's plans or his mind. Be satisfied with what God provides, and that's how you find contentment. Then we went to chapter 6, and what did you find in chapter 6? There's wisdom in pain, right? So there's wisdom in embracing pain. That was where we talked about, the good things can happen and the bad things. Both of them are from the hand of God. What is it that you do with them? So when we consider pain or we consider negative circumstances, we need to be looking, what does God have for me in this? Not that it's punishment, and that's often where our minds go. In chapter 7, what was the highlight from that? That's exactly right. So God has already communicated through Solomon that his righteousness was perfection and that man could not achieve that. And when man tries to achieve it on his own, we call that self-righteousness. And those that find out that self-righteousness doesn't work will often, instead of turning back to God, they'll deny God. Those are usually the two outcomes. So they're either broken by the self-righteous that they cannot achieve and they'll turn to God, or they'll deny that there is a God. That's usually what you will see. Then we move to chapter 8, and what did we find there? In eternal ways, things go well for men who fear God. And this is true even when the righteous don't receive, or when the righteous do receive evil here on earth. The big thing for me in Ecclesiastes was the understanding that what happens to us here is not indicative of what our eternal stance before God is? That's a big question. When you are questioning the sovereignty of God or talking to somebody about there being a sovereign God, many times the question comes up, then why do the bad things happen? They want an explanation. Here's where you would go in Ecclesiastes to say that's not how we define God. What happens to us here is not the definition of what is for us in eternity. Then we move to chapter 9. What do we find in 9? Men are born evil. That's just where the heart is. And that deeds cannot make us righteous. Sorry. God brings eternal life to some. And for those he does, we should honor him each day with our deeds. This is the definition of wisdom when we act in that way. Chapter 10. What do you remember about chapter 10? Little foolishness spoils. I've got one already. Thanks. A foolishness spoils one's life, and it can outweigh a life that's been demonstrated by much wisdom. We cannot control our future. Only God controls it. And that's important. I think we highlighted and spent time there because there's a lot of people in the modern church who would tell us, if you say the right words, pray the right prayer, do the right deeds, this is what God will do for you. That is not what the scripture tells us that we have the right to do before God. We finished chapter 11 last week. So what are the highlights you remember from chapter 11? So the future, we don't know what's coming, and we embrace the future because we know it is God's will, whatever it is, here on earth and eternally. Both are determined by God. And by living each day doing what? God's will. That's kind of this simple. I mean, there was a lot that we had to unpack to come to those conclusions, but so far, wouldn't you say that's been the conclusion of Ecclesiastes so far? God is sovereign and you're not. What else do we need to know, right? And you need to be able to embrace that here on earth by honoring him no matter what circumstances you find yourself in. And that is very difficult. Those are easy words to speak, I know, but they're much more difficult to live out, and that I know as well. And so did Solomon. So with that, we're now going to enter into chapter 12, and we're going to start with the first 5 verses. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them. Before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened, and clouds return after the rain. In the day that the watchmen of the house tremble and mighty men stoop, the grinding ones stand idle because they are few, and those who look through windows grow dim. And the doors on the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low, and one will arise at the sound of the bird, and all the daughters of song will sing softly. Furthermore, men are afraid of high place and of terrors on the road. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags himself along, and the caperberry is ineffective. For man goes to his eternal home, while mourners go about in the street. What do you think that sounds like if you were to take a guess before we go verse by verse? It sounds like the end of a person's life. That's exactly what it is. But what a creative picture that Solomon is able to give us. Back in verse 1, what focus does Solomon direct now? He says, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. What would also refer to? What had Solomon just been talking about when we finished last week in chapter 11, verse 10? All right, so he's just given a directive to remove grief and anger from your heart and put away pain from your body, because the childhood and the prime time of life are fleeting. So the reader is to remove the grief and anger from their heart and to put away the pain from the body, and now
also remember your Creator. So there's a transition there. Who is the Creator? We would call it God. And here he's identified as God, as the Creator God. Who's Creator? He says, your Creator. So he's talking to every man. Every man is created by God, and he can refer to this God as your Creator to every man. All men are to know that God is their Creator. God is the Creator of all men, believing and unbelieving. It doesn't matter whether somebody decides to believe in him or not. He's still their Creator, and they will know that one day. How does one remember? Because that's an important word. Did they forget that that was the God and now they need to be reminded? Is that the type of remember we're talking about here? It's a focusing. So what I did was I did a little word search for remember, and there's a ton of times that word was used, and I wanted to find another place where it had a similar use. So in Psalms 143 verse 5, this is what we read. I remember the days of old. I meditate on your doings. I muse on the work of your hands. So all men are to actively learn for all God has done as Creator and to meditate on what God has done. So when he says remember, that's what he's talking about. Not a pinpoint in time, but a continual meditating and musing over what the Creator has done and given. According to Ecclesiastes, when is it best for men to know their Creator? What's that? In the days of their youth. Why is it best to know the Creator in the days of our youth, according to that verse? Before the evil days come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them. So there are different words we could use. Something is good, or it can be better, or it can be the best. And what Solomon is saying is, it is best if you can remember your Creator when you're young, before the tough times come. Isn't it easier once you established you know who God is and you've been in his word and you're rooted, that when the troubles come, it's easier to remember who he is and to stay focused on making it through the tough times? Versus if you're brand new at it, it just seems like you're tossed to and fro a lot more. Does that mean somebody shouldn't come to know the Lord when they're in their middle years or their late years? Absolutely not. He just says it's best if you do it before the troubling times come or the evil days. What would you say evil days are? Well, let's look in Ephesians, where we can find the same word being used in chapter 5, 2 verses, and then we'll do 1 verse in chapter 6. So Ephesians 5, starting in verse 15. Therefore, be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. So then do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Isn't that a great summation of everything we just said that Ecclesiastes tells us to do? In chapter 6, verse 13, the continuing author says, therefore, take up the full armor of God so that you will be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything to stand firm. Doesn't that also give us a clear summation of what Ecclesiastes just said? It's better to know when you're young, to meditate and to muse on the things that he is as your Creator before the evil days come. So the evil days are the days we live out here on the earth with all of the challenges involved in our day-to-day exposure to sin and evil. Solomon says we need to know our Creator before we have to deal with those days. So back in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1, how did the verse end? And the years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them. Solomon draws us from pondering the days of evil to the years where we say, I have no delight in them. It is best to acknowledge the Creator before these years of no delight are upon us. Solomon is now moving to describing the years that have no delight in them, the years as the body ages and draws closer to death. And I will just put a plug in here. We as a culture have a lot of opportunities to go see our doctors and to take medications and to have eyeglasses and hearing aids and canes and everything else. Not everyone in every culture has had those benefits. So we can put off a lot of the descriptions that we're getting ready to go into a lot later in our lives than people used to be able to do. So we can delay aging in that way. Are we still aging? Yeah. But do we have conveniences that help us cope and deal with that aging process a lot more easy than a lot of other people do? Yes. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Not everybody has exposure to the privileges that we have in our culture. So it starts with verse 2. What picture is presented of aging? He says, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened, and clouds return after the rain. So, what causes the light of the sun and the moon and the stars to be darkened from man's perspective? Okay, right now, if I walked outside, can I see the sun? Why not? We have clouds. The clouds have come over and they have darkened the sky. Is the sun still up there shining somewhere, and the moon and the stars? So the clouds have come in and they have darkened what we see. Solomon is using the picture of the clouds arriving and dimming the light before darkness sets in completely. The clouds are specifically mentioned as what returns after the rain. Notice, not before the rain. The gloom that sets in after a rain versus the clouds clearing out. You've experienced both those kind of days, right? It rains and then the clouds break up and the sun comes out. Versus the days that it rains and the clouds hang on. It's that low cloud ceiling, right? And it just has this oppressive feel sometimes to it. That's the picture that he's looking at here. And this is often what happens in Israel during the fall. They get the rains coming in and then the clouds stick around, kind of like our clouds out there today. That's the picture. How is this descriptive of what happens to us as we age? And somebody already mentioned it. What is that? Our vision starts to go. And isn't that one of the first things? I mean, they tell you after 40, pretty much everybody starts to experience some deterioration in what they can see clearly, and they need glasses or surgery, as we talked about, right? There are things that we do to allow us to see. Imagine what life would be like if, for those of you who wear glasses or contacts, if you didn't have those. It would be a very different life. And there's a lot of people that don't have the benefit of that. And that's one of the pictures of aging that he gives here. So he's beginning to give pictures of this aging process that men can relate to. In verse 3, how else is this time described by Solomon? In the day that the watchmen of the house tremble. So trembling would be what? If you were to guess, and we know that it's related to aging, what would trembling reflect? An unsteadiness, a shakiness, right? Aren't there many as they age that have to deal with different forms of shakiness? Their hands, their head can shake, their feet, their legs. There could be trembling of different forms, right? It doesn't always affect everybody in the same way, but it does affect people as they age. Again, do we have things that we can take that help prevent that from occurring? Yeah. But if we didn't have that, you'd see a lot more of what's being talked about here in our culture. A lot more of this trembling that he's talking about. And what does he add after the trembling? And mighty men stoop. What does that look like? It's a picture of the, right? I don't know about, I'm not quite there yet, but there's the losing of height, right? The back compresses. We're not as tall as we were. For those with osteoporosis, the bones don't hold like they did. There's a bending of the body forward. There's other reasons that they're stooping. Men that have to use canes or a walker, right? That's another sign of aging. When you see somebody that starts to be more stooped over and not able to hold themselves upright the way they used to when they were young. A picture of the body losing the height, and sometimes even somebody's bent over and somebody's helping them. It's like they don't have a cane, but the wife or the husband helps the other one, or a younger person is often helping them along. What else does Solomon say? The grinding ones stand idle because they are few. What would grinding refer to? Your teeth. Your grinders. And they become few again in our culture, right? We are able to hold on to our grinders, but in a lot of cultures, that's what you'll find. They start to lose their teeth and they become few. I love this man. He just does a beautiful job of making you think. He's like, well, that's really true. So as men lose their teeth, they often then have to eat what? Softer food, right? Soups, purees. You don't see them chomping down on the T-bone steaks like they used to, right? All right, what does Solomon describe next? He says, and those who look through windows grow dim. So what would you think that the windows are referring to? The eyesight, right? You don't see as well as you used to. But I found this interesting. What does the word dim mean? If you were to look it up on my famous dictionary.com, what do you think dim means? So you don't see clearly, you don't get to see the details as well, right? Something becomes not distinct but indistinct. But it also included this definition, which I found interesting. Not clear in the mind, vague. Can't it have both meanings? So I don't see it clearly, but even the things that I hear and see, I don't remember quite like I used to. It takes me longer to get something new. I know I'm not the only one. Again, beautiful language that he uses that can capture more than just one representation of that word. So I think the description would cover both the literal ability of the eyes to see, but it would also describe the inability of the mind to comprehend or retain information as well as it once did. Verse 4, what picture does Solomon describe next? Okay, the doors on the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low. All right, so let's pick this one apart. When there is not much taken in by the chewing of the teeth, right, which he's already referred to as that the grinding mill is low, what other systems are affected? If I'm chewing, after I chew, where does the food go? It travels down, right? This is called what system? It's my digestive system that can be affected if the grinders are few. What then might be meant by the doors on the street are shut? Okay, let's just say you wouldn't need to buy as much of the toilet paper that's in shortage, okay? Try not to just be too... The digestive system is affected based on what foods are going into the system, okay? Again, we live in a different world and medications allow for different things, but if you didn't have some of that help, this is exactly what starts to happen to the system. That was about as nice as I could put that. Now, this could also be a reference to the mouth being shut to avoid food coming out. That was what one of the commentators talked about. And again, it could be both, but it's in reference to the digestive system of food and how you eat. You know, people that don't have the teeth, they got to hold their mouth together. If they're soft food, they don't need it to spill out. All right, it's getting older. It's not a positive thing in all ways. What else happens? And one will arise at the sound of the bird. When does the bird begin to sing? Early in the morning. How would you ladies know that? Because you've been up sometimes early in the morning, right? That's when the birds singing. I didn't hear birds singing when I was younger. I could sleep in just fine, but not anymore. So as we age, the ability to sleep soundly is affected, and we find ourselves waking up earlier and earlier. Hard to get a good night's sleep. What else is described? And all the daughters of song will sing softly. Okay. From the person's perspective, the song is heard how? Softly. So the person can't hear the daughters of song as well anymore as they start to lose their ability to hear. Beautiful picture of how that happens. Most people don't wake up hearing things really great one day and the next day they don't hear it at all. There's the slow progression. They're not able to hear different pitches or sounds, and so the idea of them hearing somebody singing softly is kind of a nice way to put that. Verse 5, what also happens? Furthermore, so in addition to the things he's just described about the body, furthermore, men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. So why do men become afraid of high places? Because you can fall and break a toe, or you could, right? As we get older, you don't climb stairs or places that aren't steady. You don't see, older people putting themselves in danger from higher places because they do have a tendency to fall. Sometimes you don't have to be in a high place to fall. That's exactly right. But do you see what he's giving us that picture of? As we age, we do have that tendency to be more careful and not to go to the high places. There are those who would want to, this was another thing I tied in. So this could also be not just physically, but this could be positionally. There are those who want to replace a man and take him from his high position. Does that make sense to me? I was like, well, it can be both. It can be a physical thing, but don't older people sometimes become a little paranoid, either at work, someone's going to take their place. If you've had parents that age and you want to help them with their finances or whatever, there can be a paranoia that sets in that you're not going to do right by them. And right, it's just a general fear. There's a general fear that happens as we get older. What are terrors on the road referring to? Now remember, this was back then. Now we have terrors on our road, right? So we can't apply now, but this was back then. What would the terrors on the road have been for an older person? Bandits, right? Bandits and robbers that would come along and either take your stuff, your possessions, or hurt you. Right? It takes a lot less to hurt an older person. A hit to an older person could break a rib, whereas when they were younger, that wouldn't happen. So wouldn't you think that's just another picture of people being more cautious as they get older? They're not out at a dangerous time. They're more careful when they go out. They're more vulnerable, right? I can remember, I was always amazed, I would say with my grandparents, and it would be like, well, we're going to the grocery store today. And to me, I was like, well, and what else? For them, there was one outing. There was one outing a day. I was like, okay, now I understand that better. All right, so men become more frightened with the possibility of harm coming to them as they age. What is described next? It says the almond tree blossoms. What does an almond tree look like when it blossoms? Do you know? Little tiny white flowers. Sometimes they've got pink underneath, but the tips are a bright white. So if you want to Google that and you see one, right, that's what an almond tree looks like when it blossoms. What do you think that's in reference to? White hair. So as men age, it makes them look like the almond tree when it blossoms. the hair turns gray or white. And again, in our modern culture, if we didn't have a little bottle of hair dye, how many of us would reflect more of an almond tree than we do? We cover it up, right? All right, what picture is given next? The grasshopper drags himself along, and the caperberry is ineffective. Brace yourself, ladies. Before we look at what the grasshopper might be, we're going to look at what a caperberry is, and this will help us to see what the grasshopper might be referring to. Do any of you know what a caperberry is? Well, I went to Bible Study Tools Dictionary to look this up because I'd seen some other references in a couple of the commentaries. So the familiar capers of commerce are the young buds, but the berries were the parts most used in ancient times. Their repute as excitants of sexual desire in the ancients, and it was widespread, meaning that was what it was understood to give. Like an aphrodisiac, that's what it was used for. Okay, that's a caperberry, for those of you who didn't need to make note of it. So this seems to be specific to a sexual desire, but it might have the larger implication of just physical desires in general, right? Food doesn't taste the same. We already know we're not hearing as well. So just desires in general are being affected. So the caperberry was not able to help solve the problem, which is why I wanted to define the caperberry first, because you have to understand the caperberry before you go back and define the grasshopper. So what do you think dragging the grasshopper along might mean? Again, we won't go into too much detail, but let's just say a sexual organ or sexual ability can be affected as we age. Solomon did a very creative way of making reference to that, right? One could say that it is a drag. That's my humor for today. That's right. That's right. All right, so this can be specific, or it could have the broader meaning of an inability to enjoy physical pleasures of all kinds. But the fact that he did reference to that particular berry, and that's what it was known for, that's why I would draw that conclusion. What does Solomon state eventually happens to a man? He's been through this whole process now, all these things that show aging, and what does he go to? So for man goes to his eternal home. It's like this abrupt ending, right? He's just like, these things happen, this happens, and then he goes to his eternal home. What does it mean for a man to go to his eternal home when we say that? So his body has died physically, and his spirit has gone to its eternal abode, whatever that would be. What do the physically living do? They go mourning, right? The mourners go about in the street. Was that a surprise to you to read those verses on your own and then to come back and see some of the details of how it really did apply to the aging process, but in a very creative manner? All right, so let's go to Ecclesiastes now in chapter 12, and we're just going to do verses 6 and 7. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. The pitcher by the well is shattered and the wheel at the cistern is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. So, verse 6. What does Solomon encourage men to do faced with the inevitability of death? Now we're back to remember him. So we're going to remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. So who is the he referring to? And the God that was referred to here was that God, the creator, back in the first verse of the chapter. So that's the God that we're talking about when we say him. Men are to recognize who God is as the creator and the life giver from the creation, right? You can look around and know there is a God of the creation, and more specifically from his word. The act of remembering him would happen when? Before The silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. Okay, that's again a hard one for us to understand in our culture because we have electricity. They didn't have electricity. So how did they light their rooms? They could have candles or oil, right, with a wick that would come out. So if I'm going to light up the room, I'm going to hang my lights, right, from the ceiling. And they would be some form of a bowl. So it would either be clay, porcelain. But now I want the light to reflect up, right? So you would put a little gold, a painted gold or a layer of gold inside. So can you picture that? A bowl that's got the gold lighting, and now I've got my wick and my candle here. It lets the light out. That's how I'm lighting everything up. So if I don't want the bowl to sit down where it can be knocked and I'm hanging it up, what am I going to use? Am I going to use rope or anything like that? No, because what happens if I use rope? It can catch fire. So I'm going to use metal. So they would use a silver chain to hang these bowls or their lanterns from. So it's a really thin chain that's being talked about here that if it breaks, what happens to the bowl? It's going to hit the ground, and because it's primarily made of clay, it's going to shatter. So that's the picture that we're given. In this case, if you see a bowl and the chain is broken and that bowl comes down and crashes, what happens to the light that was in it? It extinguished. Is that a picture of death then in one way, right? When the light goes out, it's over. So you remember him before the light is extinguished from a person, right? That's when you would want to be sharing with them about their eternity. This may be a picture. This goes back to, and this was just this morning, there was a really great commentary that I looked at, although old language, was Adam Clark's commentary. So if you're interested in a little more detail on each of these that give more of the physical stuff, he did a pretty good job. On this one, I like that he tied in, this may be a picture of the nervous system that's connected to the brain. And when that nervous system cord is broken, right, there's no more electrical impulses going to the brain, the light is extinguished. I thought that was interesting. I hadn't seen that until I looked at his. What is the next picture that Solomon gives? The pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel at the cistern is crushed. So the pitcher by the well would be used for what? Again, we don't run to the well every day to get our water since we have nice plumbing, we can turn it on. They didn't, so they would go to the well. There would be a pitcher. What do you do with the pitcher? You draw it down and you pick the water up with that, and that's how you put it in your bucket or whatever you were carrying around. If there's no pitcher left by the well, what are you left being able to do? You can't get any of the water, right? No water is going to be brought up. What is a cistern? It's not a well, so a well would be where fresh water, fresh underground water. A cistern's a container that you hold the water that you might get above ground. So in these days, often they would be in places that they could collect rainwater, or they would just be a place where you, while you had the freedom to go get water, you would fill up the cistern, but it would be sitting water. It wouldn't be fresh water like we would have in a well. So that's what a cistern is. What is the wheel at the cistern used for? It would be part of a pulley system, right? You would have the handle and the wheel, and you'd have some cords, and then there'd be this wheel, and then it would go down, and there'd be a bucket or something that would raise up, and you could have access to the water there, right? So if the wheel is crushed, then one cannot draw water from the cistern. Does that make sense? So basically there's no water happening, whether it's the fresh water or the cistern, you can't get any water. Again, back to the commentary that I looked at this morning that I thought did a good job. This may be a reference to the heart no longer operating to supply the blood to the body. When the ticker stops doing this, right, and there's no blood flow, then the next thing that happens is the body dies. So, does that make sense? Both of those would tie in to kind of the very last stages. So the earlier verses gave us the general aging process, but these two seem to really hone in on what happens to the body in one way or the other at the very end. In verse 7, after one dies, what is described as happening next? So the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. So the physical part of man returns to dust. We had talked about that before, but I'm going to go ahead and give some scripture references to that as well. So in Genesis 3:19, we read, by the sweat of your face you will eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Just in case anybody had a question about why we were using dust as our example, okay? Job says in chapter 10, verse 9, remember now that you have made me as clay, and would you return me into the dust again? It's asked as a question. Further down in Job chapter 34, verse 15, we read, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to dust. Psalms says in chapter 90, verse 3, you turn man back into dust and say, return, O children of men. And to bring us back full circle into Ecclesiastes, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 20, Solomon had already said this. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Simple picture, statement of fact. The physical part of men return to the dust of the earth. What happens to the spirit of men? Will return to God who gave it. So we were talking about the creator God, right? In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 1, at the very beginning of what we just started, is the same God that designates where the spirit of man will go at his death. Already something Solomon went into more detail earlier. So now he just says it as a conclusion for us to understand. The end here of chapter 12, verses 8 through 12 then. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. In addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, and he pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. The preacher sought to find delightful words and to write words of truth correctly. The words of wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. They are given by one shepherd. But beyond this, my son, be warned. The writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. Verse 8. What does Solomon conclude? Vanities of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. Where did Solomon use this exact phrase before? All the way back when we started in chapter 1, verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Exactly the same words used here. No difference. So the use of these exact words at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book demonstrates a literary device known as, does anybody know? An inclusio. There's your word for today. It's an inclusio. It's like a bookend. And you know, if you've got the bookends, everything in between those bookends goes together. Or if you go to the library and there's a shelf, they've got the bookends, isn't the same theme or topic usually what you find between the bookends on the library shelf? So this has bookends to take the beginning thoughts that Solomon gave, tie it into the end, and to hold them all together. The merism gives you, like, there's a time for birth and a time for death, two different events with everything included. So it's similar, but in literature, the inclusio goes from the beginning of a time of writing to the end. So it could be in a paragraph or a chapter, or in this case, it's a book. So that's why it's a literary device used to show that the written words are brought together. The merism was an idea of thought, an action of life versus death, and everything in between. So they're similar. They are similar. And I didn't just make that word up, so I'm going to read to you what I found for that. So you would know what an inclusio is. In biblical studies, an inclusio is a literary device based on a concentric principle, also known as bracketing or an envelope structure, which consists of creating a frame by placing similar material at the beginning and at the end of a section. Here we didn't have similar, we had exact. Although whether this material should consist of a word or a phrase, or whether greater amounts of text also qualify, and of what length the framed sections should be, are matters of some debate. Part of that debate would happen right here and right now, because there are many, as I told you in the beginning, who want to say this was not all written by Solomon. There are too many different structures of writing that occur that we don't seem to find until we look at later writing by the Egyptians or whoever else. This inclusio says, I, Solomon, started it here and I'm going to end it here, and it's all me. Yes?
Couldn't the Egyptians have stolen from Solomon?
That's exactly the point, because he's the man of wisdom, and that's why I covered that about where his wisdom and discernment came from. Of course he was the first one. Anything that came along later was somebody copying him. How often does that happen? So the use of this inclusio, to me, demonstrates the essence of the entire book of Ecclesiastes is to be taken together, and that is the point that Solomon is making as well. This would also demonstrate that the book has a consistent theme, and it was written by one man, Solomon. What did we see vanity meant back in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2, if you can remember that far back? What's that? Meaningless, right? So one of the translations that we looked at said futile was used in place of the word vanity, but the Hebrew word here had the definition of meaningless. I didn't want to say had the meaning of meaningless because that didn't sound right. So something devoid of value or significance or meaning without real substance or permanency. So we studied that back in chapter 1. I just make reference to it here again because it's a repeat from Solomon. This was indeed the theme of the book of Ecclesiastes. Life is short on earth. Most everything men spend their time doing will be meaningless, right, in the measurement of eternity. Focus then on pleasing God with the time he has given you. We did the same analysis, and it was true of the word of preacher. So for that one, I didn't just reprint the notes. I will tell you, go back to chapter 1. Look at how the word was used. Look how it was defined. It's where we came up with the word that was the definition of Ecclesiastes. It was where we found the word koheleth came from. Koheleth meant a gatherer or an assembler or a preacher. So that's why we find the word translated here as preacher. In verse 9, what does Solomon the preacher say about himself and why his word should be taken to heart? It says, in addition to being a wise man, because that was something we were able to establish, it's not bragging on himself. He's saying this is just a declaration of fact. In addition to me being a wise man, right, the preacher also taught people knowledge. So he didn't just keep the wisdom to himself. He taught people knowledge. And he pondered, which was what the whole book of Ecclesiastes was his pondering. And he searched out and he arranged many proverbs. So do you often find that an author will tell you about themselves when they're sharing something with you to give credibility to who they are so that you might want to listen to what they say? We see some details of this about Solomon himself in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 29 through 34. Now God gave Solomon wisdom and great discernment and breadth of mind, like the sand that is on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. So we'd read that before. For he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, Heman, Calcol, Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was known in all the surrounding nations. Do you know who any of those men are that were listed? Apparently, their great wisdom did not survive the ages as well as Solomon's did. I'm sure if I did more research into ancient history, there's probably things that have been uncovered about them and we would know their wisdom, but it would pale in comparison to Solomon's wisdom. Verse 32, he also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He spoke also of animals and birds and creeping things and fish. He was incredibly wise. Men came from all peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. Let that sink in. How incredibly brilliant this man was. All given by God. Do we find men that walk among us today that are so brilliant that all other leaders of all other countries listen to them? No, those don't exist. They just don't. There can be men with great wisdom, but not like this man. So Solomon's words in Ecclesiastes, he's not bragging on himself. They are simply words of truth of all God had given him to be shared. His wisdom was given by God, and in every way he could, he shared that wisdom. Verse 10, this is summed up by Solomon how? He says, the preacher sought to find the delightful words, like grasshopper, and to write words of truth correctly. That was always his goal. Not to be boring as he wrote it out, but to use delightful words to bring about truth. That was Solomon's goal. I think we can agree Solomon was very creative in his approach to sharing his thoughts with us here in Ecclesiastes. And if you take the time and you read through the Proverbs and the Song of Songs, you will find more ways in which Solomon's amazing talent has been saved in the scriptures for us. Now, I can't wait until I get to read all 3,000 of his Proverbs one day, or hear the songs that we don't have access to today. But they will be something that we will get to hear one day. Verse 11, what was the purpose of Solomon writing these words? He says, the words of wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. They are given by one shepherd. So what does the word goad mean? Right, to provoke sometimes, to annoy, to stimulate someone into action. That's what to goad someone means. We have a very negative connotation of it. Somebody goads you, it's usually in a negative way. Sometimes that's what it takes. I don't nag, I just am a consistent reminder. Right? Yes?
Also what they call the instrument that they direct elephants with.
Right. Right. So because it's about the pointing and getting their attention and getting them to move along. So that's a good picture of it. So the words have the purpose of causing one to take action in their life once they understand what's at stake. Did Ecclesiastes do that for you? What description is given next? And masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. All right? What does one being a master of something mean? Right. It's a person with the ability and the power to use that ability, right? To control or dispose of something. Like when we talk about somebody gets a master's degree, lots of information, and then we put it together. Or somebody who does work and they've been an apprentice for a time period, they have to actually achieve the work at a certain level before they move from an apprentice to what's considered a master, right? So it's mastering the information, not head, knowing how to use the information. So what would masters of the collection be? So those who not only hear, but use and control their actions by what they've learned. That would be a master of the collection. What is a well-driven nail? Well, first of all, it's the right size for the job. If I need a nail this long and I've only got one this long, it's not very helpful, right? So it's got to be the right size. It needs to be pushed in at exactly the right angle. Sometimes it's a straight angle, sometimes it's a 90-degree angle, right? So the well-driven nail will be the right size at the right angle, and it would need the exact right force for the intended goal. If I have a nail and I have a broken arm and I can't lift, I can't barely get to it, that's not going to drive it in, right? It needs exactly the right force. And if I take a nail and I hit it too hard, I can change the angle of it or mess up the plaster that I'm trying to go into, right? So everything about that needs to be perfect. Right size, right angle, right force. That's what being the master is like a well-driven nail. All those things come together. Verse 12, where did this wisdom come from? They are all given by one shepherd. They refers to who? The words. The words given as well as the masters of achieving the action. That's the they that's being referred to in that verse. Both of these are given by who? One shepherd. Are we in doubt about who the one shepherd is? There is only one God who gave Solomon his wisdom and his words. And that is the one shepherd that is given here. That's why in a lot of your Bibles, you'll find the word shepherd is in capital, because it's a reference to God. So the truly wise receive their wisdom from him. Verse 12, what warning does Solomon give on the topic of the use of words? He says, beyond this, so beyond the good things about what you should be able to do as a master of the words, be warned. The writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. So for any of you here who are absolutely in love with books, this is Solomon talking to you, not me. Okay? Just saying. There can be the writing of too many books and an endless supply of books, right? At some point in time, somebody can be buried in their books and not ever get around to living life, right? We're talking excessive here. Books that are not guided by the one shepherd are probably in view in particular. What can men do with too many books, according to that verse? Excessive devotion to the books is wearying to the body. So what is excessive devotion to books look like? Too much time, would you say, given either to the writing of or the reading of books. Gluttony in any form should be avoided. What impact can this excessive devotion have? It's wearying to the body. This is a way to encourage people to not just know what the books contain, but to use their body in a real way to live out the actions revealed in the study of the books and the wisdom demonstrated. Remember, he just talked about all the writing that he had done. Other scriptures told us about the songs he wrote and the Proverbs and all the other things he was involved in. He's talking at an excessive level that becomes negative and no life was lived out. Would Solomon have been described as a person who never did anything but write? We have tons of descriptions of the things that he built, the walls, the temple, right? Even things he shouldn't have been building that he was busy building. He was an active person, not just sitting around reading the books. For us, we can also look at this in the New Testament in James chapter 1, verse 22 through 25. Prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, he's immediately forgotten what kind of person he was. But one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed in what he does. This is not just about busy work or physical doing. That's also not what Solomon is alluding to, or James. Our responses can be different to people when our hearts are changed by what we learn as hearers of the word. That's also an action. When you respond to somebody differently than you did before, you've been changed by the words. We can have a different approach to God because of what we have learned about him as hearers of the word. So let's say I was prone to pray for God to make changes because I think I know best and he should do what I want. If I understand what I've read here, do I change how I approach God in my prayer life? Do I want him to change my heart then? That's a doer as well. This would include our heart changes and causes us to actually work for others and for God. It's a change of heart. That's what the doing, the reading and the words penetrated my heart, affected a change in me, and you will see that as a different life lived out. Not just busy work. Does that make sense? Our work is not just physical busy work. It can be a phone call. It can be the things that we do for others. So now back to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. We have verses 13 and 14. And so that we're not confused, Solomon says, the conclusion, when all had been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. In verse 13, Solomon sums up his work how? He says, the conclusion, he doesn't want you to miss that he's at the end, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. So this is what Solomon says you should remember about Ecclesiastes right here. In conclusion, this is what he would like you to remember. What does it mean to fear God? Reverence. We have a tendency to need to explain that, though, because when we say you need to fear something, it comes with the negative connotation of fear, right? When we have fear, it's usually from a negative. So let's look at some words that were used in regards to fear God, and let's see what surrounds the fear of God. Exodus 18:21 says, furthermore, you shall select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain. And you shall place these over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. Leviticus said in chapter 25:17, so you shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 10:12 says, "Now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require from you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways and love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul." Job said in chapter 1, verse 8, "The Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning from evil.'" Not to leave the New Testament out, we go to Acts chapter 13, verse 23. "Brethren, sons of Abraham's family, and those among you who fear God, to us the message of this salvation has been sent." And even in Revelation chapter 19, verse 5, we read, "And a voice came from the throne saying, 'Give praise to our God, all you his bondservants, you who fear him, the great, the small and the great.'" So, those who fear God, just in this, I had to cut out a lot because there's a lot of references if you want to do a word search yourself. Just in these, here's a few list of things that when we fear God are associated with that fear. We will be men of truth. We will hate dishonest gain. We will not wrong one another. We will walk in the ways of God. We will love God. We will serve God with all our heart and soul. We will turn away from evil. The message of salvation has been sent to those who fear God. We will give praise to God. That's what the fear of the Lord looks like. It's not trembling in some corner. The fear of God causes those reactions to be how we respond to God. Back in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, in that verse 13, what else were we to do? Keep his commandments. Well, what do we think that means? Well, let's look at a couple verses in the Old Testament. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 6 said, "Therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him." So we have the commandments tied with the fear in that verse. And then in Deuteronomy 13:4, we read, "You shall follow the Lord your God and fear him, and you shall keep his commandments. Listen to his voice. Serve him. Cling to him." So there is a summation of the law given in the New Testament, and Jesus was in agreement with the summation. We find that in Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25. A lawyer stood up and put him to the test. So this is a lawyer asking a question of Jesus, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" So this man does not recognize Jesus as Messiah. He calls him teacher. And he said to him, "What is written in the law, and how does it read to you?" So that's Jesus questioning the lawyer. Typical lawyer. It's good to ask a lawyer a question as an answer to their question. Verse 27, and he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, Jesus said to the lawyer, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." Also in John chapter 14, verse 21, we read, "He who has his commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by the Father, and I will love him, and will disclose myself to him." 1 John chapter 3, verse 23 says, "This is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he commanded us. The one who keeps his commandments abides in him, and he in him. We know by this that he abides in us by the Spirit whom he has given us." Later in 1 John chapter 5, verse 3, For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. Do you understand what it looks like to be in the fear of the Lord and to keep his commandments? It's not going back to the law, right? It's not listing out all the do's and the don'ts. That's not what keeping the commandments are. It's always with the heart of love, a focus on serving God, and in doing so, serving one another. And for those of you who've done the 1 John study, was that not the whole emphasis of the entire book of 1 John? Love one another. By that, you demonstrate you have the Spirit. So back to Ecclesiastes. I don't normally do that, run through and just throw verses at you. But I did a little research to bring those verses to you when you look at the notes. If you'd like to go see those used in context, that'll give you a chance to do some final Bible study on the book of Ecclesiastes if you'd like. You can also do your own word search on fear of the Lord and see what else is in the scriptures about the definition of that word or keeping his commandments. So I read through and did a subset. So if you want more of that, you are free to do that. So Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 14. Why is it important to fear God and to keep his commandments? God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. So we're given the why of what we're told to do. Ecclesiastes 3:17, this is what Solomon had already told us. I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man. For a time for every matter and for every deed is there. So Solomon made it very clear way back at the beginning in chapter 3, exactly what it was that was the reason that we should be doing the right thing before God. Psalms 96 verse 13 says this, before the Lord, for he is coming to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness. So we know who the judge is. Solomon gave that to us. We see that again in the Psalms. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, starting in verse 6. Therefore, being always of good courage and knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. We are of good courage. I say and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be home with the Lord. Therefore, we also have as our ambition, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. Does that sound like exactly what Solomon just got through telling us at the end of this fabulous book? There is a judgment coming for all things, and Solomon's warning is that while we were still here on earth, we are to have a focus in what we do to be pleasing to God with the eternal focus in mind. That's the sobering reality of this amazing book of Ecclesiastes.